A pipeline is cut, a tanker route is threatened, a power grid depends on imported fuel, a battery factory waits on minerals mined half a world away. Within days, markets react, governments recalculate, militaries revise contingency plans. This is the unusual nature of energy. It is never just one sector among many. It sits beneath industry, transport, war, communication, and domestic stability. When energy is secure, states can grow, produce, and project power. When it is disrupted, even strong states begin to reveal their limits. That is why superpowers do not compete over energy only when supplies are scarce. They compete because energy is the foundation on which modern power rests. And as the world moves from coal to oil and gas, and now toward batteries, grids, and critical minerals, the forms of competition change, but the logic remains. Control the fuel, the route, the technology, or the standard, and you shape the system that others depend on. The common assumption is that superpowers compete for territory, ideology, or military advantage, and that energy is only one part of that contest. In practice, energy often sits much closer to the center. Modern economies require vast and continuous flows of power. Factories need electricity, transport systems need fuel, data centers need stable grids, armed forces need oil, refined products, electricity, logistics, and industrial supply chains to remain operational. A major interruption in any of these can quickly move from economics into politics, and from politics into security. This is what makes energy different from many other strategic goods. It is the input behind almost every other input. And because the resources, routes, and technologies involved in energy are not evenly distributed, some states hold leverage, while others carry vulnerability. That imbalance has shaped global politics for more than a century. The forms have changed. Coal ports became oil choke points. Pipeline corridors became sanction targets. Solar modules and battery supply chains are now entering the same strategic space, but the underlying pattern has stayed remarkably consistent. Superpowers compete for energy because dependence is dangerous and control is powerful. In the 19th century, the first great era of energy geopolitics centered on coal. Coal-powered factories, railways, steamships, and early industrial navies. It was the energy base of industrialization, which meant that access to coal deposits, coaling stations, and maritime routes became strategic concerns for imperial powers. Naval planning was already energy planning. A fleet without fuel was not a fleet. This was the first important lesson of modern power. Industrial strength and military reach depend not only on technology, but on the energy system beneath it. In the 20th century, oil and gas gradually displaced coal in the most strategic sectors. Oil-powered cars, trucks, aircraft, naval fleets, and mechanized armies. Gas supported industry, heating, and later electricity generation on a larger scale. Oil in particular transformed mobility and warfare at the same time. This shift mattered because oil was not just another fuel. It was the fuel of motion. And once states understood that access to oil could determine industrial performance, military flexibility, and wartime endurance, energy competition moved to a different scale. The Middle East, Eurasia, and parts of the Americas became more than resource regions. They became strategic zones inside the global balance of power. After the Second World War, the United States emerged not only as a military and economic superpower, but also as a central organizer of the post-war energy order. It had large domestic production, major companies, and growing influence over the security architecture of the Middle East. This mattered because Gulf oil was becoming essential to Allied growth, industrial expansion, and later the wider functioning of the global economy. At the same time, the Soviet Union developed its own energy sphere, especially through oil and gas production across Eurasia. Pipelines to Europe created a relationship that was neither simple dependence nor simple autonomy. It was structured interdependence, shaped by geography and politics. Then producer states began to assert themselves more openly. The formation of OPEC in 1960 signaled that energy would not remain under the quiet control of large consumer powers and multinational firms. Producers wanted greater influence over prices, output, and sovereignty over their own resources. This did not remove competition, it deepened it. Consumer states began coordinating more actively. Producers began acting collectively where possible. Superpowers increasingly treated energy access and energy order as strategic concerns, not merely commercial ones. By the 1970s, this reality became impossible to ignore. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 changed how governments thought about vulnerability. The Arab oil embargo, imposed during the Yom Kippur War, demonstrated that energy could be used not only for income, but for political coercion. Importing economies faced shortages, inflation, and strategic anxiety. The second shock, tied to the Iranian Revolution and later the Iran-Iraq War, reinforced the lesson. Energy supply was not simply a market issue, it was a national security issue. In response, consuming states institutionalized their defenses. Strategic petroleum reserves were expanded. The International Energy Agency helped coordinate policy among major importers. Diversification of suppliers and routes became central to long-term planning. This is one of the recurring patterns in energy rivalry. A shock exposes dependence. Dependence triggers adaptation. Adaptation reduces one vulnerability, but often creates another. The coercive use of energy can work in the short term, but it also teaches the target to reorganize. That is why energy weaponization is powerful, but rarely permanent. So is energy really the main driver of great power rivalry? Or is it only one factor among many? The answer is that energy is rarely the only cause, but it is often the condition beneath other causes. Ideology matters, security dilemmas matter, domestic politics matter, but without energy, armies do not move, industries do not scale, and technological systems do not hold together. Energy is not always the headline, it is often the structure underneath the headline. As the 20th century moved into the 21st, the map of rivalry became more infrastructural. Pipelines, liquefied natural gas terminals, ports, compressor stations, and electricity grids created new points of leverage. Superpowers and major regional powers did not only seek access to resources, they sought control over how those resources moved and who depended on which route. This is where smaller states often became exposed. Transit countries such as Ukraine, or states located near key maritime choke points, found themselves carrying risks created by larger powers. If you value calm, in-depth explanations like this, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more videos that uncover the systems shaping our world. Energy rivalry was no longer confined to producer and consumer capitals. It ran through borders, shipping lanes, compressor stations, and local political systems. Russia's gas disputes with Ukraine in the 2000s made this visible to Europe. Supply interruptions and pricing conflicts showed how energy could be used to signal power, punish rivals, and test the resilience of a larger regional system. But those same disruptions also encouraged Europe to diversify. Again, the pattern repeated. Coercion created leverage, then leverage created adaptation, then adaptation weakened future leverage. This does not mean energy lost importance, it means energy rivalry became a contest, not only over access, but over resilience. The next major shift came from technology. Hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling transformed the United States into the world's largest producer of oil and gas by the 2010s. This reduced its exposure to external supply shocks and gave it new diplomatic options, especially through liquefied natural gas exports. That shift mattered because it changed more than trade balances. It changed the psychology of dependence. A state that produces more of its own energy, or that can export to allies, has more room to maneuver. It can impose sanctions more confidently. It can support partners more credibly. It can frame energy competition from a position that is less defensive than before. Liquefied natural gas added another layer. Gas that once depended mostly on fixed pipelines could now move more flexibly by sea. This did not eliminate geography, but it loosened some constraints. Importers gained new options, exporters gained new markets, infrastructure choices became strategic choices. What technology did in this case was not end rivalry. It redrew the map on which rivalry took place. The war in Ukraine exposed both the power and the limits of weaponized energy. Russia had long used gas exports to Europe as a source of revenue and influence. Europe, in turn, had accepted a degree of dependence because pipeline gas was efficient, abundant, and economically attractive. The relationship looked stable until geopolitical conflict made its fragility impossible to ignore. When Russian gas flows were cut and European states scrambled for alternatives, the consequences were immediate. Prices rose, industrial systems came under pressure, governments intervened, LNG import capacity was expanded, renewables deployment accelerated in some areas, demand was adjusted, suppliers diversified. This episode episode is crucial because it reveals a central truth. Energy dependence creates leverage, but leverage can destroy itself if overused. A supplier that treats dependence as a weapon may win short-term pressure, but it can also drive customers to re-engineer their entire system. The result can be a permanent loss of trust, market share, and influence. So energy coercion is real, but it is not unlimited. Its success depends on time, alternatives, and the target's capacity to reorganize. At this point, another question appears. Does the energy transition end this pattern, or does it simply move the struggle elsewhere? The evidence so far points to the second answer. The fuels may change. The competition does not disappear. It shifts from wells and pipelines toward minerals, manufacturing, grids, storage, and industrial standards. The strategic logic survives the technological transition. Today, superpower competition is no longer centered only on oil fields and gas corridors. It increasingly includes solar manufacturing, battery production, electricity networks, hydrogen systems, and the processing of critical minerals such as lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, and rare earth elements. China has built major dominance in several of these areas, especially solar modules and battery manufacturing. This matters for the same reason oil once mattered. If a state controls large portions of the supply chain for foundational energy technology, it gains industrial advantage, export leverage, and strategic insulation. The United States and the European Union have responded with industrial policy, subsidies, domestic content rules, and efforts to reduce dependence on rival supply chains. This is sometimes described as a green race. That phrase is useful but incomplete. What is happening is not only a race to decarbonize, it is also a race to determine who will control the next energy system's critical nodes. In earlier eras, those nodes were oil concessions, refineries, pipelines, and tanker routes. Now they increasingly include cathode materials, processing plants, battery factories, semiconductor-linked power equipment, and the standards that govern grids and clean technology deployment. The object of competition has evolved. The structure of competition has not. Several structural causes explain why this rivalry keeps returning. First, energy is the input of inputs. Without reliable energy, industrial growth slows, digital systems weaken, transport falters, and political stability comes under pressure. Second, resources and routes are unevenly distributed. Oil, gas, uranium, and critical minerals are concentrated in specific places. So are the choke points and transit routes that move them. That creates lasting asymmetries. Third, infrastructure creates lock-in. Pipelines, grids, refineries, ports, vehicle fleets, and factories last for decades. States cannot switch suppliers or systems quickly without major cost. Fourth, energy has a dual civilian and military role. It powers economies, but it also powers navies, air forces, logistics systems, surveillance networks, and defense industries. Fifth, energy is tied to state revenue and domestic legitimacy. For exporters, it funds governments. For importers, price spikes can create inflation, unrest, and political damage. This gives external energy strategy direct domestic consequences. And sixth, energy is entangled with finance and technology. Sanctions, export controls, insurance, payment systems, industrial standards, and advanced equipment all shape who can build, ship, sell, or scale energy systems. This is why superpowers never treat energy as neutral. It is too central, too concentrated, and too politically usable. Across coal empires, oil orders, gas pipeline politics, and clean technology races, the same long pattern is visible. Great powers build spheres of influence around energy. They try to secure supply at tolerable prices. They shape standards and rules. They protect routes. They subsidize domestic capacity. They use exports and technology to build alliances. And sometimes they use disruption, sanctions, or cut-off threats to impose costs on rivals. But each attempt at leverage produces a response. Targets diversify, new technologies emerge, alternative routes are built, domestic political coalitions shift, dependence changes form rather than disappearing. This means energy rivalry is not static. It evolves through a repeated cycle of control, vulnerability, adaptation, and rebalancing. Smaller states often bear the cost of that cycle most directly. Transit states, importer states, and producer states caught between larger blocks experience the shocks first, even when the rivalry originates elsewhere. That too is part of the structure. Superpower competition over energy is global in cause, but often local in consequence. Superpowers compete for energy because energy is not only fuel, it is capacity. The capacity to manufacture, manufacture, the capacity to transport, the capacity to command military force, the capacity to preserve political order, and increasingly, the capacity to shape the technologies that will define the next phase of economic life. From coal stations to oil choke points, from Soviet pipelines to LNG terminals, from tanker wars to battery factories, the forms have changed, but the logic has endured. Energy remains the terrain where economics, strategy, geography, and technology converge. That is why the rivalry persists even during transition. The world may be moving beyond some old fuels, but it is not moving beyond the need to control the systems that make power possible. And as long as modern life depends on large, concentrated, politically contested flows of energy, superpowers will continue to see energy not merely as a commodity to buy, but as a structure to shape. If this video gave you a clearer way to understand the world beneath the surface, subscribe to Beneath Systems for more deep dives every week.